The alarm screamed through the communications deck of the Meridian station, and every screen flashed red at the same time, and Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez nearly dropped her coffee as she lunged for her console, and her fingers moved across the holographic display with practiced speed as she tried to identify the source of the distress signal. Commander Lisa Grant burst through the door 3 seconds later, and her uniform jacket was only half-zipped, and her dark hair was still loose around her shoulders. Because she had been in her quarters trying to catch a few hours of sleep after a double shift, and those plans were clearly over now. What do we have? Amy's face was pale in the glow of the screens, and she shook her head slowly. Ma'am, you need to see this, and it's coming through on every single frequency, and whoever sent this wanted to make absolutely sure someone would hear it. Lisa moved to stand behind Amy's chair and watched as the data streamed across the display, and the signal was strong, despite coming from a system that was at least 3 jumps away, and that meant someone had put an enormous amount of power behind the transmission, and people only did that when they were desperate. Can you decode it? Already done, and ma'am, it's not in any language we have on record, but the translation software managed to work through it, and the message is simple. Amy pulled up the text, and Lisa felt her stomach tighten as she read the words. Help us, and we cannot hold them much longer, and our world is dying, and please, if anyone can hear this, we need you now. Below the text was a string of coordinates and a timestamp that showed the message had been sent 6 hours ago, and attached to the bottom was a single compressed image, file open. Amy hesitated for just a moment, and then she opened the file and the image filled the main screen, and Lisa heard someone gasp behind her, and she turned to see that half the night shift crew had gathered in the doorway, and they were all staring at the screen with wide eyes. The image showed a woman standing on a cliff edge with a burning city spread out in the valley behind her, and the woman had silver hair that fell past her shoulders, and her ears came to delicate points, and her eyes were the color of violets, and she wore armor that looked like it had been forged from moonlight, and beside her stood 3 massive creatures that could only be described as dragons. The dragons were enormous, and their scales shimmered with colors that shifted between deep purple and midnight blue, and their wings were folded against their bodies, but even folded, they looked large enough to block out the sun, and their eyes glowed like molten gold, and smoke curled from their nostrils. The woman in the image looked directly at the camera, and her face was streaked with ash and blood, and her expression held exhaustion and determination in equal measure. And in her hand, she held a sword that still dripped with something dark. Lisa stared at the image for a long moment and tried to process what she was seeing, because humans had been exploring space for 50 years, and they had found ruins, and they had found bacteria, and they had found one species of primitive aquatic creatures, but they had never found anything like this. Get me everything we know about that system. Amy's fingers flew across the console, and after a moment she shook her head. Not much, ma'am, and the system is designated Sector 712, and it has 1 inhabited planet in the Goldilocks zone. And we did a basic scan about 8 years ago and marked it as uninhabited. And there were some unusual energy readings, but nothing that suggested advanced life. Clearly, we missed something. Corporal Jake Morrison pushed his way through the crowd at the door and moved to the weapons console, and he was a big man with dark skin and kind eyes, and he had been with Lisa since her first command, and she trusted him more than almost anyone. Ma'am, are we actually considering? Responding to this, Lisa looked at the image again, and at the woman with the dragons, and at the burning city, and she thought about all the reasons they should not get involved, and they were in unexplored territory, and they had no idea what kind of conflict they would be walking into, and the Meridian Station was a research and monitoring outpost, not a warship, and Command would probably order them to wait for reinforcements, but reinforcements would take weeks to arrive, and whoever had sent that message had said they could not hold much longer, and that meant days at most and probably hours. We're going, and Amy plot a course, and Jake, I want every weapon system checked and double-checked, and I want to know exactly what we have to work with, and everyone else get to your stations, and we jump in 30 minutes. The crew scattered, and Lisa stood alone in front of the screen and stared at the woman and the dragons, and she wondered what kind of enemy could push someone with creatures like that to the point of sending a desperate plea across the stars. She pulled up the message again and read it 3 more times and tried to find any other information, but there was nothing else, and just those few words, and the coordinates, And the image Lisa keyed her communicator and connected to the station's captain quarters where Commander Helen Price was likely still asleep, because she had pulled the previous double shift. "Helen, we have a situation." 10 minutes later, Lisa stood in the briefing room with her senior staff, and Helen Price sat at the head of the table and rubbed her eyes. And she was older than Lisa by 15 years, and had gray streaking through her brown hair, and she had seen more combat than anyone else. "On the station, you want to take my station into an unknown conflict based on a single distress call?" "Yes, ma'am." Helen looked at the image on the screen and then back at Lisa, and her expression was unreadable. "You know, this could be a trap, I know. You know, we are not equipped for sustained combat. I know, you know, command will have your head if this goes wrong." "I know that too." Helen leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment, and everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath, and finally, she nodded slowly. "Then we better make sure it doesn't go wrong, and I'll authorize the jump. But Lisa, if we get there, and the situation is beyond our capabilities, we retreat immediately." And understood. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of activity, and Lisa changed into her combat uniform and pulled her hair back into a tight braid and checked her sidearm twice, even though she knew it was loaded, and she tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong when she arrived on the command deck. The crew was already at their stations, and Amy had the navigation plotted, and Jake had 3 weapons officers working the combat systems, and Helen stood near the captain's chair and watched everything with calm alertness. Lisa took her position at the tactical station and pulled up the sensor displays. "All stations report ready." One by one, the department heads confirmed, and Lisa felt her heart beating faster in her chest, and she looked at the image of the woman and the dragons one more time, and then she nodded to Helen. "Take us out." The Meridian Station's engines flared to life, and the massive structure began to move, and it accelerated away from its orbital position and headed for the jump point. And behind them, the monitoring satellites continued their endless watch over empty space, and ahead of them lay 3 jumps and whatever waited on the other side. Amy counted down the seconds to the first jump, and her voice was steady despite the tension Lisa could see in her shoulders, jumping in 3 and 2 and 1. The stars stretched and twisted, and reality folded in on itself, and the Meridian Station disappeared from normal space. And when it emerged again 30 seconds later, they were a third of the way to their destination. Lisa checked the sensors and saw nothing unusual, and they were in an empty system that humans had mapped years ago, and nothing had changed. Second jump in 5 minutes, and everyone stay sharp. The crew worked in focused silence, and Lisa used the time to review everything they knew about the station's capabilities, and they had defensive shields that could take a beating, and they had missiles and energy weapons and point defense systems, and they had a crew of 80 people who were trained for research and monitoring and not warfare, but they also had something else, and they had the human tendency to show up when someone called for help, and to fight even when the odds looked impossible, and that had to count for something. The second jump came and went, and they were now in a system that was only 1 jump away from their destination. Amy turned to look at Lisa, and her face was pale, but determined. "Ma'am, once we make this last jump, we are committed. And if there is a hostile force there, we won't have time to run. I know, and make the jump." The final countdown seemed to take forever, and Lisa gripped the edge of her console and thought about the woman with the dragons, and wondered if they were already too late. The stars stretched one more time, and the Meridian Station dropped back into normal space, and the sight that greeted them made every person on the command deck freeze. The system ahead was full of ships, and dozens of dark, angular vessels swarmed around a blue and green planet, and they were firing on the surface and on scattered defensive platforms, and explosions bloomed like deadly flowers against the darkness of space. "Holy God!" Jake's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried through the silent deck. Lisa took a breath and steadied herself, and then she started giving orders because there was no time for doubt anymore. "Amy, get me a communications line to that planet, and Jake, target the nearest hostile ship, and Helen, I need you to authorize." Weapons free all across the station. Alarms began to sound, and the crew moved with sudden urgency, and the Meridian Station turned toward the battle, and its weapon systems came online on. The first enemy ship to notice the Meridian Station turned with terrifying speed, and its weapons glowed bright red as it charged up to fire, and Lisa watched it on her tactical display and felt time slow down to a crawl-jake fire. The corporal's hands moved across his console with smooth precision, and 3 missiles streaked away from the station, and they left trails of white exhaust against the black void, and the enemy ship tried to evade, but the missiles adjusted their trajectory and closed the distance in seconds, and the impact sent a shockwave of light and debris expanding outward. Direct hit and target destroyed. Lisa allowed herself 1 second to feel relief before the next crisis hit, and alarms began screaming as 5 more enemy ships broke away from their attack on the planet and turned their attention to the human station. Amy, evasive pattern Delta, and Jake target the lead ship, and Helen. Our Shields commander Helen Price stood near the captain's chair and watched the tactical display with calm focus, and she had seen worse situations than this, though not by much. Shields at full capacity. But ma'am, we cannot trade shots with 5 ships at once. Then we don't trade shots and we hit them before they can. Coordinate. The Meridian station banked hard to port and the inertial dampeners struggled to compensate, and Lisa felt her stomach lurch. But she kept her eyes on the display and watched as the enemy ships tried to surround them. These ships were unlike anything in human databases, and they were dark and angular with surfaces that seemed to absorb light, and their weapons fired beams of purple energy that left afterimages burned into the vision of anyone who looked directly at them, and they moved with a grace that suggested either excellent pilots or advanced automation. Jake kept firing, and 2 more missiles found their mark, and another enemy ship broke apart. But the remaining 4 were getting closer, and their return fire hammered against the station's shields, and the deck shook with each impact. Shields down to 70%. Lisa pulled up the communication interface and started working on establishing contact with the planet below, because they needed information, and they needed allies, and they needed them. Fast to me, keep transmitting on all frequencies and use the same language patterns from the distress signal. I'm trying, ma'am. But there's a lot of interference, and the enemy is jamming most channels. Then find one. There, not jamming. The station shuddered as 3 beams struck the shield simultaneously, and the lights flickered for a moment before the backup power kicked in, and Lisa gripped her console to steady herself. We need to thin out these ships now. Working on it, ma'am, but they're faster than anything I've ever seen. On the planet's surface, Kayla stood among the smoking ruins of what had been her city's main defensive tower, and her 3 dragons crouched beside her with their wings spread wide to shield her from falling debris, and she watched the battle unfolding in the sky above and felt something shift in her chest. The new ship was fighting with a ferocity that reminded her of the old stories, and the stories her grandmother had told about warriors who never backed down no matter how bad the odds looked, and the ship was smaller than the Kresh vessels, but it moved with purpose and struck with precision. Her communication crystal began to glow, and it pulsed with a soft blue light, and she pressed her hand against it and felt the strange vibration of an unfamiliar language trying to push through. This is Commander Lisa Grant of Earth, and we received your distress call, and we are here to help, but we need to coordinate our efforts. Kayla's translator, Stone, worked to decode the words, and when she understood them, she felt tears spring to her eyes, and she blinked them away furiously because there was no time for tears now. This is Kayla of the Silvery, and you came, and I did not think anyone would come. We're here, and now tell me what we're dealing with. The Kresh, and they came 3 days ago without warning, and they want our world, and they want our dragons, and they have been pushing us back ever since, and we have maybe 200 defenders left and 50 dragons still able to fight. Lisa processed this information quickly, and she looked at the tactical display and counted at least 40 enemy ships, and the math was not good. How long can you hold? Hours, maybe? And not more than that. Then, we need to change the game, and I need you to get your dragons in the air, and I need them to follow our lead. Kayla looked up at her 3 companions and felt their eagerness through the bond they shared, and the dragons wanted to fight, and they wanted to protect their home, and they were waiting only for her command. What do you need us to do? Lisa's voice came back strong and clear. We're going to draw their attention, and when we do, I need your dragons to hit them from below and hit them hard and aim for their engines and their weapon systems, and then pull back before they can focus on you. Kayla raised her sword, and her dragons spread their wings for our world. The communication went silent, and Kayla sent out a mental call through the bond she shared with all dragons on her world. and it was a gift of her bloodline and a power that had been passed down through generations, and she felt the response immediately as dragons across the planet heard her voice in their minds. Brothers and sisters and the humans have come to help us, and we fly now and we fight together, and we show the Kresh that this world is not theirs to take. The sky erupted with the sound of dragon wings, and dozens of massive forms launched themselves upward, and they were creatures of legend and power, and their scales gleamed in colors that ranged from deep emerald to brilliant gold, and their roars shook the ground. On the Meridian Station, Lisa watched as thermal signatures began appearing on her sensors, and they were coming up fast from the planet's surface. "Ma'am, I'm reading multiple large heat sources. Those are our dragons, and Jake, when they hit, I want you to focus everything we have on the command ship, and Amy, can you identify which ship is coordinating their attacks?" Amy worked her console and highlighted a larger vessel that hung back from the main fighting, and it was twice the size of the other Kresh ships, and dozens of communication beams connected it to the rest of the fleet. "That one, ma'am. And it's directing everything." "Perfect, and Helen, I need you to authorize full burn, and we're going straight for it." Helen's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Authorization granted, and God help us all." The dragons hit like a storm, and they came up from beneath the Kresh ships where the enemy sensors had been focused on the Meridian Station, and they tore into the enemy formation with claws and fire and teeth, and the Kresh fleet scattered in confusion. Kayla rode on the back of her largest dragon, and his name was Thorian, and he had been her bonded companion since she was a child, and together they moved through the battle with practiced coordination, and she pointed her sword at a Kresh ship, and Thorian responded instantly. His jaws clamped down on the ship's wing, and his claws raked across its hull, and fire poured from his mouth and melted through the armor plating, and the ship began to spin out of control, and Thorian released it and moved to the next target all around them. Other dragons fought with equal fury, and the Kresh had never faced anything like this, and their ships were built for space combat and for fighting other ships, and they were not built to deal with living creatures that could survive in the void and tear through metal with their bare claws. Lisa saw her opening, and she gave the order, "Amy, full burn now." The Meridian Station's main engines flared to full power, and the entire structure shook with the force of acceleration, and they shot forward. Through the gap the dragons had created in the enemy formation, and smaller Kresh ships tried to intercept. But Jake was ready. He fired everything they had, and missiles and energy beams cut through the void and found their targets, and 3 enemy ships exploded, and 2 more were disabled, and the path to the command ship opened up. The command ship's crew realized the danger too late, and they began turning to bring their main weapons to bear. But the Meridian Station was already too close. "Jake, target their shield generators and fire everything." The station's weapons lit up the darkness, and focused beams of energy struck the command ship's shields, and for a moment, nothing seemed to happen. And then cracks began spreading across the shimmering barrier, and the shields flickered and failed. "Now hit them with everything else." Missiles streaked across the remaining distance and slammed into the exposed hull of the command ship, and explosions rippled across its surface, and secondary detonations began tearing through its interior. Kayla saw what was happening, and she directed Thorian upward, and they climbed above the battle, and she raised her sword high and sent out another mental call. All dragons converge on the large ship and finish it more. Then 30 dragons turned as one and descended on the wounded command ship, and their combined fire was apocalyptic, and the massive vessel began breaking apart, and its debris field spread across several kilometers. Without their coordination, the Kresh fleet faltered, and ships collided with each other in their panic, and some tried to flee toward the outer system, and others continued fighting, but without direction and without purpose. Lisa slumped forward against her console and tried to catch her breath, and every muscle in her body ached from the tension. "Status report." Amy's voice was shaky but triumphant. "Enemy fleet is breaking up, ma'am, and most are fleeing, and the ones still here are being engaged by the dragons. Jake, kill anything that's still shooting at us or at the planet. Already on it." Helen moved to stand beside Lisa and put a hand on her shoulder that was either brilliant or insane, maybe both. The landing shuttle broke through the clouds, and Lisa pressed her face against the small window to get her first real look at the silvery world, and what she saw took her breath away. The planet was beautiful, even in its wounded state and forests. Of silver trees stretched across rolling hills and crystal-clear rivers cut through valleys that glowed with bioluminescent flowers. And in the distance she could see mountains that reached so high their peaks disappeared into the clouds and scattered. Across the landscape were cities that looked like they had been grown rather than built, with towers that spiraled upward like ancient trees. But everywhere Lisa looked, she also saw the scars of war, and smoke rose from burning buildings and craters, marked where fresh weapons had struck the ground, and in some places entire sections of forest had been reduced to ash and blackened stumps. Corporal Jake Morrison sat across from her in the shuttle, and he stared out his own window with wide eyes. And beside him, Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez checked her tablet for the 100th time, even though the coordinates had not changed. "You okay, Amy?" The lieutenant looked up and managed a weak smile. "Just nervous, ma'am. And we are about to meet aliens, and real, actual aliens with pointed ears and dragons." Lisa understood the feeling, because her own stomach was doing flips. But she kept her voice calm and steady. "We just fought alongside them, and they are allies now, and treat them with respect. And we will be fine." The shuttle descended toward a large clearing on the outskirts of what had once been a magnificent city, and now half of it lay in ruins, but the other half still stood proud and defiant. And at the center of the clearing stood a group of figures waiting. The shuttle touched down with a soft thud, and the rear hatch hissed open, and Lisa took a deep breath and stepped out into alien sunlight. The air smelled like flowers and smoke in equal measure, and the gravity was slightly lighter than Earth standard, which made each step feel a bit too easy, and the temperature was warm but comfortable. And 2 suns hung in the sky, one larger and one smaller, casting double shadows across the ground. Waiting in the clearing were a dozen Sylvari, warriors, and they all had the same pointed ears and elegant features that Kayla had shown in the distress signal, and their armor was battered and scorched, but they stood with straight backs and proud expressions, and behind them 3 massive dragons rested on the ground with their wings folded and their golden eyes watching everything. At the front of the group stood Kayla herself, and she looked even more striking in person than she had in the image, and her silver hair was pulled back in a braid, and her violet eyes met Lisa's with an intensity that felt like being seen all the way to the soul. And in her hand she still carried her sword, though now it was sheathed at her side. Lisa walked forward, and her crew followed behind her, and she stopped a few feet from Kayla. And for a moment neither woman spoke, and they simply studied each other across the small distance that separated their species. Finally Kayla spoke, and her voice was softer than Lisa expected. "You are Commander Lisa Grant of Earthiam, and you are Kayla of the Sylvari." Kayla smiled, and it transformed her face from stern warrior to something warmer and more welcoming. "I am, and welcome to Ethermore and what remains of it, anyway." Lisa looked around at the damaged city and felt a pang of sorrow. "I am sorry we did not arrive sooner." Kayla's expression shifted to something fierce and determined. "You arrived when it mattered most, and that is what counts, and because of you and your crew. My people still have a home, and our dragons still have a sky to fly in." One of the dragons behind Kayla rumbled deep in its chest, and the sound vibrated through the ground, and Lisa felt it in her bones, and the dragon's head moved forward until its massive face was only a few feet from her, and she could feel the heat radiating from its scales and smell the sulfur on its breath. Kayla placed a hand on the dragon's snout and spoke in a language that sounded like music. "This is Thorian, and he is my bonded companion, and he wants to thank you as well." Lisa looked into the dragon's golden eyes and saw intelligence there, and awareness, and something that might have been gratitude. And she reached out slowly and placed her hand on the dragon's scales, and they were warm and smooth like polished stone. "The honor is mine." Thorian made a sound that might have been approval, and then pulled back and settled onto the ground again, and Kayla turned to gesture toward the city. "Come, and my people have prepared food and shelter, and we have much to discuss." They walked through the streets of the city, and everywhere Lisa looked, she saw signs of the battle that had raged here, and buildings with walls blown open, and streets cratered by weapons fire, and places where dragon fire had scorched the stone black. But she also saw Sylvari working to repair the damage and clearing debris, and tending to the wounded, and children playing in the spaces between the rubble, and life continuing, despite everything. The Sylvari people stopped to watch as the humans passed, and they stared with open curiosity. and some whispered among themselves, and a few even bowed, which made Lisa uncomfortable, because she had only done what anyone would do. Kyla led them to a building that looked like a palace made of white stone and silver metal, and inside the damage was minimal, and they entered a large hall with a high ceiling and windows that let in both sun's light, and in the center of the room was a long table already set with food. "And drink, please, sit and eat, and you must be exhausted." Lisa and her crew settled around the table, and the food was unlike anything they had ever seen, and there were fruits that glowed softly, and breads that smelled like honey, and meats that had been seasoned with herbs that filled the air with complex aromas, and pitchers of clear liquid that tasted like spring water mixed with starlight. As they ate, Kyla sat at the head of the table, and other Sylvari leaders joined them, and they introduced themselves, and Lisa tried to remember all their names, but there were too many, and her exhausted brain could barely keep track. One of the leaders was a tall man named Aldrich, who had scars across his face and arms, and he looked at Lisa with respect. "We owe you a debt that can never be repaid, and the creche would have destroyed us without your intervention." Lisa set down her cup and shook her head. "You do not owe us anything, and we did what was right, and that is all." Another leader spoke, and this one was a woman with dark green hair named Lyria. "But why? And you do not know us, and we are strangers from a distant world, and why would you risk your lives for strangers?" Jake answered before Lisa could, and his deep voice carried across the hall. "Because that is what humans do, and when someone calls for help we answer, and it does not matter if we know them or not." Amy nodded in agreement. "We are all just trying to survive in this big universe, and if we do not help each other, then what is the point of any of it?" The Silvery leaders looked at each other, and something passed between them and understanding, or maybe respect, and Kayla leaned forward with her hands clasped on the table. "The creche will come back, and they always do, and they do not give up easily, and when they return they will bring more ships and more weapons." Lisa had been thinking about this during the entire flight down. "Then we need to be ready, and we need to strengthen your defenses, and we need to establish communication with Earth and get reinforcements out here. How long will that take? Weeks at minimum, and maybe months, but in the meantime my crew and I can help you repair your defensive platforms and train your people in human combat tactics and set up an early warning system." Kayla smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "You would stay, and even though you have already done so much." Lisa looked around the table at the Silvery leaders and at Jake and Amy, who both nodded their support. "We started this fight together, and we will finish it together." Aldrich stood and raised his cup. "Then let us make an oath, and humans and Sylvari standing as allies against those who would destroy us, and let this be the beginning of a friendship that will last through the ages." Everyone around the table stood and raised their cups, and Lisa felt something warm spread through her chest, and this was bigger than one battle, and this was the start of something important, to friendship and to survival and to doing what is right. The words echoed through the hall, and outside the dragons roared their approval, and the sound carried across the city and gave hope to everyone who heard it. After the meal, Kayla took Lisa to the highest tower in the palace, and from there, they could see the entire city spread out below them, and in the distance the forests and mountains, and beyond that, the curve of the planet against the stars. "Your world is beautiful." "It is, and even broken. It is still home." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Kayla spoke again, and her voice was soft. "I have a question, and if you do not mind answering." "Of course. Why do humans fight so hard for others? And I have heard stories of warriors and heroes, but never of an entire people who would rush into danger for strangers." Lisa thought about this and tried to find the right words. "Because we know what it is like to be alone and to be afraid, and to feel like no one is coming to help, and humans have fought each other for thousands of years, and we have made terrible mistakes, and we have learned the hard way that the only thing that matters in the end is whether you stood up when someone needed you, and whether you did the right thing, even when it was hard." Kyla nodded slowly. Then, "Humanity is worthy of the friendship we offer, and I think our peoples will learn much from each other." Lisa smiled. "I think so too." The morning suns rose over Ethermore and cast long shadows across the training field where Lisa stood with her arms crossed and watched as Jake tried to explain human military tactics to a group of confused Sylvari warriors. And it was not going well. No, and you need to use cover, and hiding behind trees is not a strategy. when the enemy has weapons that can vaporize the entire forest. One of the Silvari warriors was a young man named Kieran, and he looked genuinely puzzled. But we have always fought this way, and the dragons provide air support, and we move through the trees and strike from the shadows. Jake rubbed his face with both hands, and Lisa could see his frustration building. That works great against enemies on the ground, but the Kresh attack from space, and they do not care about your trees, and they will just burn everything. And you need to think about defensive positions and overlapping fields of fire and tactical retreats. Kieran exchanged glances with the other warriors, and they all looked skeptical. Tactical retreat, and you mean running away? No, I mean living to fight another day. Across the field, Amy was having better luck teaching a group of Silvari technicians how to use human sensor equipment, and she had set up several portable units that could detect ships entering the system from light years away. And the Silvari were fascinated by the technology. So this box can see ships before they arrive. Amy nodded and pointed to the display screen. It detects the energy signature of ships dropping out of hyperspace, and it gives us about 30 minutes of warning before they reach the planet. And 30 minutes to prepare defenses and evacuate civilians and get the dragons in position. A Silvari woman, named Mira, touched the screen gently as if afraid it might break. This is incredible, and we have nothing like this. And the Kresh always took us by surprise. Not anymore. Lisa watched the training continue and felt a mixture of pride and worry, because her crew was working themselves to exhaustion, and they had been on Ethermore for 5 days, and in that time they had repaired 3 defensive platforms and trained 200 Silvari warriors and set up a sensor network that covered the entire system, but it was not enough, and everyone knew it was not enough. Kayla approached from behind and moved so silently that Lisa did not hear her until she spoke. Your people are good teachers. Lisa turned and smiled. Your people are good students, and they learn fast. They walked together toward the edge of the field where Thorian and 2 other dragons were resting in the shade of a massive silver tree, and the dragons watched everything with their intelligent golden eyes. Kyla sat down on a fallen log and gestured for Lisa to join her. I received word from our outer settlements, and the Kresh attacked 3 farming communities last night, and they burned the fields and took prisoners. Lisa felt anger surge through her chest. How many prisoners? 15. And mostly children. The words hit Lisa like a physical blow, and she clenched her fists. Why children? Kayla's expression was dark. The Kresh study us, and they want to understand how we bond with dragons, and they think if they take children they can learn our secrets and create their own dragon riders. That is horrific. Yes, it is. But it is also an opportunity. Lisa looked at Kayla sharply. What do you mean? The Kresh have a base on our outer moon, and that is where they take the prisoners, and that is where they launch their attacks, and if we could destroy that base, we could stop them from returning. How many ships guard it? Kayla pulled out a small device that projected a holographic image of the moon, and a large facility sat on its surface, surrounded by defensive weapons and docked ships. Our scouts counted 20 ships and maybe more inside the hangar, and the base has shields and heavy weapons, and we have tried to attack it twice, and both times we lost half our dragons. Lisa studied. The hologram in her mind raced through possibilities, and 20 ships was too many for the Meridian Station to handle alone, and even with dragon support the odds were terrible. We need a plan that does not involve a frontal assault. I am open to suggestions. Lisa stood and paced back and forth, and the pieces began falling into place in her mind. The Kresh shields, and how do they work? They project outward, and they protect against energy weapons and projectiles. What about something moving slowly? Kayla frowned. I do not understand. If we could get close to the base without triggering their sensors, and if we could move slow enough that they think we are just debris or a meteor, and then once we are past the shields we hit them from inside, that would require getting very close without being detected. We have stealth shuttles, and they are designed for covert operations, and the Kresh have never seen human technology before, and they might not recognize the signature. Kyla's eyes widened. You would do this, and you would risk your people to rescue mine? Lisa met her gaze. Yes. That evening, Lisa gathered her senior staff in the palace and spread out the tactical plans on the table, and Jake and Amy studied them carefully, and neither looked happy. This is dangerous, ma'am. Jake's voice was quiet but firm. I know we could lose the shuttle and we could lose everyone on it. I know that too. Amy leaned forward and tapped the hologram. What if we modify the shuttle's engines and if we add Silvari stealth crystal technology, we might be able to mask our signature even better. Can that work? Kayla had joined the meeting and she nodded. Our crystals bend light and energy, and combined with your technology, it should make you nearly invisible. Jake crossed his arms and, once we are inside the shields, then what? And we have maybe 10 minutes before they realize what is happening. Then we use those 10 minutes to do as much damage as possible, and we target their power generators and their shield emitters and their communication arrays, and we create enough chaos that the dragons can attack from outside. Amy pulled up a new display. If we can knock out their shields for even 60 seconds, the dragons could pour through and destroy the docked ships. Kayla smiled. People would be ready and we would hit them with everything we have. Lisa looked around the table at her crew. This is volunteer only, and I am not ordering anyone to do this, and it is too dangerous. Jake snorted. With all due respect, ma'am, you are not going without me. Amy nodded. Same here. 2 more crew members stepped forward and they were both engineers and both had worked on the defensive platforms. We are in. Lisa felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she pushed it down and focused on the mission. Then, we go tonight, and the longer we wait, the more danger those children are in. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation, and the shuttle was modified with Silvari crystals that made its hull shimmer with an oily rainbow sheen, and weapons were checked and rechecked, and the flight path was programmed into the navigation computer. Kyla found Lisa in the hangar as she did her final equipment. Check. I wish I could go with you. Your place is here, and your people need you to lead them, and besides, someone has to coordinate the dragon attack. Kayla pulled something from her belt and held it out, and it was a small crystal that glowed with soft blue light. This is a bond stone, and if you are in danger, press it and I will know, and Thorian will come. Lisa took the crystal and felt its warmth in her palm. Thank you. Kayla stepped closer and placed a hand on Lisa's shoulder. You have become a true friend to my people, and to me, and please come back. I will do my best. The shuttle launched under cover of darkness, and its modified engines were nearly silent as it slipped away from Ethermore and headed toward the distant moon. Inside the cramped cabin, Lisa sat in the pilot seat and watched the moon grow larger on the view screen and behind. Her Jake monitored the weapon systems, and Amy tracked their position relative to the Kresh base. So far, so good, and no indication they have spotted us. The moon's surface was gray and lifeless and dotted with craters, and on the far side, just coming into view, was the Kresh base, and it sprawled across several square kilometers, and ships sat in neat rows like predatory insects, waiting to launch. Lisa reduced their speed to a crawl, and they drifted closer like a piece of space debris, and the base's sensors swept over them twice but did not react. Amy's voice was barely a whisper. We are past the outer sensor perimeter. Lisa adjusted their trajectory and aimed for a crater near the base's power station. 2 minutes to landing and everyone ready. Jake armed all their weapons, and the 2 engineers moved to the rear hatch and prepared the explosive charges they had brought. Lisa brought the shuttle down in the crater, and the landing was so soft it barely kicked up any dust, and through the view screen she could see the base less than a kilometer away, and it was enormous up close. Time to move. They exited the shuttle and moved across the lunar surface in the low gravity, and each step took them several meters, and they covered the distance quickly and reached the base's outer wall. Amy pulled out a device and attached it to the wall, and it began cutting through the metal with a bright blue beam. Once we are inside, we have maybe 8 minutes before they lock down the facility. Then, we better move fast. The wall fell away and revealed a dark corridor beyond, and Lisa led her team inside and activated her helmet light, and the base interior was cold and sterile and smelled like ozone. Jake checked his tactical display power station. Is 300 meters ahead. They moved quickly through the corridors, and twice they heard Kresh soldiers moving nearby, but managed to avoid detection, and finally they reached the power station, and it was a massive room filled with humming generators. The engineers set their charges and programmed the timers. 5 minutes, and then this whole place goes dark. The explosions rocked the Kresh base and sent shockwaves through the corridors, and Lisa grabbed onto a support beam to keep from falling as the lights flickered and died. and emergency red lighting kicked in a moment later. Jake shouted over the alarms and his voice was barely audible. Power station is down and shields should follow in 30 seconds. Lisa pulled out her weapon and aimed it down the corridor where heavy footsteps were approaching. Everyone get ready, and they are coming. 3 Kresh soldiers rounded the corner, and they were tall and covered in dark armor that made them look like shadows given form. And their weapons glowed with that same purple energy that their ships used, and they fired without hesitation. The team dove for cover behind support pillars, and return fire lit up the corridor, and Jake's shots found their mark, and 1 Kresh soldier went down, but 2 more appeared behind the first group. Amy worked frantically on her tablet and monitored the shield status. Shields are fluctuating in 20 seconds. More Kresh poured into the corridor, and Lisa realized they were running out of time and out of options. We need to move now. They ran deeper into the base, and the 2 engineers provided covering fire as they retreated, and the Kresh followed, and their weapons tore chunks out of the walls and ceiling. Amy pointed to a side corridor. The detention center is this way, and if we can reach the prisoners, we can use them as leverage, or we can actually save them. Like we came here to do both, and we do both. They burst through a door into a large open room, and rows of cells lined the walls, and inside the cells were silvery children, and they looked terrified, and some were crying, and others pressed against the bars, with wide eyes. Lisa's heart clenched. Get those cells open now. The engineers rushed forward and began working on the lock mechanisms, and the technology was different from anything they had seen, but human ingenuity was good at solving problems, and within seconds the first cell clicked open. A small Silvari girl stumbled out, and she could not have been more than 8 years old, and her silver hair was matted, and her violet eyes were huge in her pale face. Are you here to save us? Yes, and we are. Getting all of you out of here. The cells opened one by one, and 15 children emerged, and they clustered together in fear, and Lisa knelt down to their level. Listen to me, and we are friends of Kayla, and we are going to take you home. But you need to be brave for just a little bit longer, and can you do that? The children nodded, and some of them wiped tears from their faces, and the oldest child was a boy who looked about 12, and he stepped forward. We can be brave, and we are Silvari. Good. And now stay close and do exactly what we say. Jake guarded the door and fired at Kresh soldiers who kept trying to force their way in. Ma'am, we cannot hold this position much longer. Outside the base, the dragons arrived like an avenging storm, and more than 100 massive forms descended on the moon, and Thorian led them with Kayla on his back and her sword raised high. The base shields flickered and died, and the dragons poured through the gap. Kayla felt the rush of wind and the heat of dragonfire and the fierce joy of battle, and she directed Thorian toward the docked ships, and his claws tore through hull plating, and his fire melted weapon systems. All around her, other dragons attacked with equal fury, and the Kresh scrambled to respond. But they had never faced an assault like this, and their ships tried to launch, but dragons tore them apart before they could achieve orbit. Inside the base, Lisa's communicator crackled to life. Lisa, we are here, and the shields are down. And tell me where you are, detention center and east side of the facility. And we have the children, but we are trapped. Hold on. And we are coming. The building shook as something massive landed on the roof, and debris rained down from above. And then, a section of the ceiling tore away and moonlight poured in, and Thorian's massive head appeared in the opening. His golden eyes found Lisa and the children, and he rumbled deep in his chest. Kayla's voice came through again. Thorian, we'll get you out. The dragon lowered his head into the room, and the children gasped, and some moved forward with wonder, because they had grown up with dragons but had never seen one up close. In a rescue, Lisa helped the first child climb onto Thorian's neck, and then the next, and the children held onto his scales with small hands, and they were no longer crying. Jake and Amy and the 2 engineers climbed up next, and finally Lisa pulled herself up and wrapped her arms around one of Thorian's spines. We are on, and Thorian lifted his head and launched himself into the air, and his wings spread wide and caught the thin atmosphere, and he soared away from the base just as another explosion tore through the power core. The entire facility began collapsing, and Kresh soldiers fled in all directions, but the dragons showed no mercy. And fire rained down from above, and within minutes the base was nothing but twisted metal and smoke. Thorian carried them back toward Ethermore, and the flight took nearly an hour, and Lisa held tight to the children and made sure none of them fell. And below them the planet grew larger and more beautiful with each passing moment. When they finally landed in the clearing outside the palace, there was a crowd waiting, and Sylvari parents pushed forward with desperate hope on their faces, and when they saw their children climbing down from Thorian's back, the cries of joy were almost too much to bear. Parents swept children into their arms, and tears flowed freely, and the reunions were chaotic and beautiful, and Lisa stood to the side and watched with her own eyes burning. Kayla approached and threw her arms around Lisa in a fierce embrace. "You did it, and you saved them all." Lisa hugged her back. "We did it together." Celebration that followed lasted well into the night, and the Sylvari brought out food and drink, and music filled the air. And dragons flew overhead in complex aerial displays, and humans and Sylvari danced together under the light of 2 moons. Jake found Lisa sitting on a stone bench near the edge of the celebration and nursing a cup of something that tasted like honey wine. "You okay, ma'am?" Lisa smiled. "Better than okay. And we made a real difference here." "We did. And so what happens now?" That was the question, and Lisa had been thinking about it all evening. And the Meridian Station had sent word back to Earth, and reinforcements were coming. But they would not arrive for weeks. And in the meantime, the Kresh threat remained. We stay, and we help them rebuild, and we make sure they are ready if the Kresh come back. And if they do come back, then we fight again. Jake nodded slowly. "I can live with that." Amy joined them, and she looked exhausted but happy. "The sensor network just picked up something, and you need to see this." They followed her to the command center and watched as the display showed multiple ships dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Lisa felt her heart sink. "How many?" Amy checked the readings, and then her face broke into a smile. 12, and but ma'am, they are not Kresh, and they are broadcasting Earth identification codes. The reinforcements arrived 3 days early, and it was a full battle group with cruisers and fighters and support ships, and when the lead vessel made contact, the captain's face appeared on screen. "This is Captain Patricia Cole of the Earth Defense Force, and we received your reports and came as fast as we could. And Commander Grant. I have to say, you have started quite the interstellar incident." Lisa smiled. "Good to see you, Captain, and we have a lot to catch you up on." Over the next few days, the Earth forces integrated with the Sylvari defenses, and human engineers worked alongside Sylvari craftsmen, and the 2 peoples learned from each other and shared knowledge and technology. Kayla and Lisa stood together on the palace tower and watched as human ships patrolled alongside dragons in the sky above. "Your people are remarkable, and you came when no one else would, and you risked everything for strangers." Lisa shook her head. "You are not strangers anymore, and you are friends, and you are allies." Kayla reached out and took Lisa's hand. "The Sylvari have a saying, and it translates roughly to those who stand together in the darkness. We'll walk together in the light. I like that, as do I. And so what will you do now that your reinforcements have arrived, and will you return to your station?" Lisa thought about the Meridian Station sitting in orbit, and about Earth, and about the life she had before receiving that distress signal. And then she looked at the city below, where humans and Sylvari worked side by side to rebuild what had been lost. "I think I will stay for a while longer, and there is still work to be done here. And besides, someone needs to make sure our peoples continue to get along." Kayla laughed. "I think we will manage just fine, but I would be glad for your company." A dragon's roar echoed across the city, and both women looked up to see Thorian soaring overhead, and the sun caught his scales and made them shimmer like jewels. Lisa squeezed Kayla's hand. "You know, when we first received your distress signal, I was terrified, and I had no idea what we were getting into. And now I cannot imagine having missed this, and having missed meeting you and your people and being part of something bigger than myself. That is what the best moments in life feel like, in the moments when we connect with others and when we make a difference." They stood together in comfortable silence and watched as the 2 suns began to set and painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. And in the distance, more dragons took flight, and their wings caught the light. Somewhere in the depths of space, the Kresh were licking their wounds and planning their next move, but here on Ethermore there was hope, and there was friendship, and there was the unshakable certainty that whatever came next, humans and Sylvari would face it together.